Please take your seats so we can get started. Our first speaker kicking this off, of course, is our Commanding General, Major General, soon-to-be Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. When I first asked him about doing this, he said, "Hey, man, I'm not that old." But I think his subject's very important when you look at his background, all the work he has done. He's going to talk about U.S. strategy in Vietnam, continuities in war, and lessons learned for today and tomorrow. I remember Secretary of the State at one time, Henry Kissinger, said, "When we look back from history, Vietnam will be a very small blip on that line." Well, with all due respect to Dr. Kissinger, I don't think that's the case. I think Vietnam has made a major impact on the way we train, the way we prepare for war, the attitude toward war. It's really been a learning exercise, and we continue to learn. So I can think of no one better able to address this topic than Major General H.R. McMaster.
General Kavesa, thank you so much, and thanks for the tremendous privilege to being able to address you. Katie and I are really honored to be with all of you here today. You know, and I'm really among heroes here, people who are my heroes, both in uniform and out of uniform. For the heroes in uniform, it's the veterans of the Vietnam War. Those of you who served there with great distinction under very difficult conditions in which it was very hard at times to see how the risks that you were taking, the sacrifices your soldiers were making, were contributing to that political outcome. And those were problems associated with strategy. And rather than diminish your performance and your courage, it magnifies it, in my view. And the reason why I began to study and research about Vietnam and was drawn to the conflict to learn about it was I thought it was very important for me as a young officer to learn as much as I could from our most recent conflict. And I learned tremendous amounts about leadership and about the leadership of the individuals you'll see on this panel that will follow this talk this morning. So it's a tremendous honor to be with you based on what you did in Vietnam, under the most difficult and challenging experiences, conditions. But it's also an honor to be with you because many of you continued to serve in the period after Vietnam and built the Army we have today and led a real renaissance in our Army, a renaissance that we're still riding on, frankly. I mean, the revolution in leader development and training and doctrine, in our combat capabilities. I mean, that is what has provided us with the ability to overmatch our enemies on the battlefield. And so I thank you for that as well. So I thank you for everything you've done for our Army and our armed forces, and I thank you for your example, and for many of you, your direct support and mentorship over the years. For those out of uniform, Joe Galloway is here, who I think is one of the most courageous men I know, and who is, I think, particularly worthy of mention because he helped connect our military, connect our soldiers with the people in whose name they fought. And he did that from battlefields that were dangerous, and he put himself in danger so he could tell that story to the American people. And so today we have our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, mainly soldiers and Marines. And it's great to see so many of our Marine brothers here. Semper Fi to you guys. You know, who are fighting against brutal, murderous enemies who are the enemies of all civilized people. And I think one of the things that is most remarkable, in particular about the Afghan war, is it may be the most underreported war in American history. And so we need more Joe Galloways, I think, today more than ever. And it's a privilege to be with him. Others out of uniform, it would include Mayor Tomlinson, who you just saw recognized here today. And I mentioned it is more important than ever that we stay connected to the people in whose name we fight. And you know, we say this, but it's really, really true. It is the best relationship between a military installation and a community in anywhere. And it's because of her leadership, it's because of the leaders of others in the community, you know, the Pucketts, who provide a bridge for us back into our communities. So thank you so much for the privilege of being here among heroes in uniform and heroes out of uniform. And thank you for the National Infantry Museum. What an awesome facility, a place that helps us orient our citizen volunteers to what it means to be a professional, and as a fundamental part of their transformation into soldiers. And so thank you for your vision, thank you for what you've done with this museum, and thank you for the many synergies we have between Fort Benning and our mission and this wonderful facility. So as Joe Cavesa mentioned, I was reluctant to do it. You know, I mean, I am not quite that old as you guys, or mature, as Colonel Puckett would say, as you guys are. But really, I thought I could talk to you about what we've learned, or maybe should have learned from Vietnam, and how that relates to the lessons of our most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, as you know, as the debate about policy and what to do in both Afghanistan and Iraq intensified, you couldn't escape, really, analogies to the Vietnam War. People on all sides of those debates invoked Vietnam to generate support for their position. Some suggested that from a grand strategic perspective, conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq against these Takfirist or Salafi jihadists, really these irreligious people who use a irreligious ideology to justify criminal, murderous behavior, the struggle against them today was analogous to the struggle against transnational communist movements and communism and communist totalitarian and authoritarian regimes in the Cold War. So the war on terror to the Cold War was an analogy. Others suggested that, that Afghanistan and Iraq appear similar to the American experience in Vietnam because just at a general level, they present complex problems that demand interconnected political, military, economic, and cultural solutions or dimensions to the solution of those problems. But I think before we accept the latest analogy to Vietnam, we might consider that our record of learning from history generally, and the history of the Vietnam in particular, it's not very good. It's not very strong. And so indeed, as Yen Phoon Kong argued in her book, a book called Analogies at War, Korea, Munich, Dien Bien Phu, and the Vietnam decisions of 1965, the misuse of history muddled analysis and made decision-making even harder during the escalation of our effort in Vietnam. Similarly, Jeffrey Record, he offered a particularly cogent warning against the pitfalls of reasoning by historical analogy. When carefully considered, the conflicts in Iraq and in Afghanistan and Vietnam, they exhibit a lot more differences, certainly, than they do similarities. And one accepts, if you accept a lesson of Vietnam, that you have to pay attention to those differences, to those local realities, and not make generalizations rather than try to fit experiences into some sort of framework or theory, then that should provide warning that we shouldn't be too eager, maybe, to learn lessons of previous conflicts. And then, of course, what some have called the Vietnam syndrome, a belief that the United States should simply avoid military intervention altogether. That was maybe the most prominent and immediate so-called lesson from the Vietnam War. And this was associated with the mantra of no more Vietnams. So across the 3 decades that followed the 1973 Paris Peace Accords that ended the American involvement in that war, assertions that the use of force would lead to another Vietnam, as you all remember, appeared in connection with military operations in Latin America, in the Horn of Africa, the Balkans, Southwest Asia, and Central Asia. In the 1980s and the early 1990s, the desire to avoid another Vietnam inspired what became known as the Weinberger-Powell Doctrine, an effort to set clear preconditions for the use of military force. America would employ military force only if vital interests were at stake, when victory was the objective, when war was the last resort, and when a decision for war enjoyed sufficient congressional and public support. America would apply overwhelming power, achieve decisive victory, and then withdraw to avoid protracted entanglements. But in the 1990s, critics of this doctrine said that this discouraged early intervention that could have prevented maybe a larger conflict in cases such as Bosnia. And it also may have permitted humanitarian crises that America might have otherwise have prevented, such as those in Rwanda and broadly in the Balkans. But then the military success of the Gulf War in 1991, military success due in large measure to many of you in this room, General McCaffrey in particular, I'm looking at here at the front table, it seemed to highlight the effectiveness of the doctrine and suppress the most difficult memories of Vietnam. President George H.W. Bush declared after the Gulf War that America had finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome. However, it was in part the memory of Vietnam that influenced decisions to end that war quickly and then leave open, really, the question of what to do about the regime of Saddam Hussein in the long term, a regime that the president had likened to the Nazi regime of World War II. So based on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and our experiences there, I think Vietnam analogies are making a comeback. And it seems possible, I think, that the old Vietnam analogies from those 3 decades after the 1973 peace accords will be conflated with Afghanistan and Iraq analogies and produce something like the Vietnam syndrome on steroids. And there are dangers, of course, as I mentioned, in this simplistic use of history. It clouds our understanding rather than imparts understanding. And it can also be used to justify flawed policies and bad decisions about national security. So I think maybe the first thing we need to do is recognize limitations of the Vietnam War analogy and also analogies to Iraq and Afghanistan. But at the same time, I think we've got to leave room, right, for thinking hard about what we learned in these wars. And so I think it's for this reason that it's still useful and, in fact, very important for us to ask the question of what might we really learn from Vietnam? What might we really learn from Afghanistan? What might we really learn from Iraq? As Dr. Conrad Crane, though, observed, he said that the United States Army failed really to learn from Vietnam because it regarded the war as an aberration and then as a mistake to be avoided. It might sound familiar in connection with how we're tending to regard our experiences both in Iraq and Afghanistan. Crane argued that the Army was unprepared for counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan and in Iraq in large measure because we decided that we weren't going to do another Vietnam, that we weren't going to be involved again in an endeavor that required so-called nation building or winning hearts and minds. Crane argued that although the post-Vietnam period emphasized defeating the Soviet threat to Western Europe and focusing on that helped produce this renaissance in the Army that I discussed at the outset, that focus at times divorced war from its political and social context. So as a result, aspects of the Vietnam experience that might have informed our planning for Afghanistan, that might have informed our planning for Iraq, received little attention. So I do believe that today we're in danger. We're in danger of disregarding not only the lessons of Vietnam, but also the lessons of the wars in Iraq and the war that we're still fighting in Afghanistan. And these lessons, I think, these lessons that cut across those 3 wars are lessons really in 4 areas that have to do with continuities in the nature of war, just fundamental continuities across wars, across time. And the first of those continuities will come as no surprise to the professional officers here, because it's going to begin with a Clausewitzian observation. War is political. War is fundamentally political. Much of the debate over Vietnam has focused on deficiencies, rightly so, I think, in American strategy for the war. Analysts such as Colonel Harry Summers argued that a neglect of the operational art, the ability to connect tactical victories to strategic aims, was the central issue. American forces, others argued, were particularly ill-suited to face the challenge of combating an insurgency in the complex geopolitical and the complex physical environment of Southeast Asia. Others have argued that no strategy was capable of addressing the weakness of the South Vietnamese government, and that without a legitimate government in Saigon, military operations were futile. Still other historians argue that such critiques are one-sided because they fail to give adequate attention to the complex Vietnamese communist strategy of Dao Tran, a strategy that employed the mosaic of shifting political and military actions. But what is common about all these interpretations is the conclusion that there was no simple or purely military solution to the problem of Vietnam, just as there is no simple or purely military solution to the problems that we had in Iraq and we were confronting there and the problems that we're confronting in Afghanistan today. So success in conflicts like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq all require defeating enemy insurgent and conventional forces, countering enemy political initiatives, and helping indigenous governments and militaries develop the effectiveness and the legitimacy necessary to secure the population, address people's basic needs, security being foremost among them, and turning people against the enemy. Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, therefore, all posed multifaceted problems that demanded sophisticated, integrated strategies relevant to the situations in those countries. That's a continuity, I think. The second continuity, war is human. In Vietnam, the strategy of graduated pressure aimed to use covert raids and tit-for-tat reprisal bombings to convince Ho Chi Minh and leaders of North Vietnam to desist from supporting Vietnamese communist forces in the South. Graduated pressure gave a simple solution to that complex problem in Vietnam, because it would allow the United States to control the situation, control the escalation of military effort, and improve the situation in Vietnam cheaply, efficiently, and without, importantly to Lyndon Johnson, attracting undesired attention from Congress and the American people. The strategy, however, it failed to consider military actions in their human context, that is, their cultural, psychological, economic, and historical context. Vietnam communist leaders were committed to winning, even at an extraordinarily high price. They had demonstrated this very recently in the first Indochina War against the French. The Vietnamese were culturally predisposed to take a long view rather than adhere to this sort of short-term point of view that we were applying to the war. Ho Chi Minh and other members of the Hanoi leadership viewed the fight against Americans in context of previous historical struggles against the French, the Chinese, and the Japanese. Moreover, the primarily agrarian nature of North Vietnamese society limited the effect of bombing economic targets as a means of coercion. So viewed in historical perspective, in cultural perspective, sensitive to the human aspect of war, the idea in 1964 and into 1965 that covert operations and selective bombing would force the enemy to desist, it was a fantasy. It was a fantasy. The third continuity that I think is really critical for us to understand across all of these wars is that war is inherently uncertain. And Secretary of Defense McNamara, in the period of time during which Vietnam became an American war, he and his principal assistants, though, they were insensitive to that uncertainty of war. And they were insensitive to the previous observations about the political and human dimension of war. And they looked at Vietnam like a business management problem that they believed would ultimately succumb to their reasoned judgment. Some planners in the State and Defense Department were attorneys who viewed, not that there's anything wrong with that, Mayor and others here, but they were attorneys who actually viewed North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh through the lens of the reasonable man theory of English common law. And they ignored the political and military sources of enemy strength in the South, and they focused on establishing, quote, from their strategic planning documents, a common law pattern of bombings against the North and attacks, again, to alter Ho's behavior. These planners failed to view our actions, U.S. actions, from the enemy perspective. They failed to analyze Vietnamese communist sources of strength or consider potential enemy actions and initiatives. Indeed, as the North Vietnamese did not regard these raids as signals, but as acts of war that demanded a response. And it is the interaction, that continuous interaction with the enemy, that makes war uncertain. In Afghanistan and in Iraq, I think we had some similar difficulties in planning out linearly the future course of events. If you think about it, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, we tended to predict years in advance the level of troops we would have there and so forth. And in fact, we are so linear in our thinking about war oftentimes that I think you could almost describe our thinking about it as narcissistic in terms of only defining the war in relation to us and what we would like to do and not giving adequate agency to the enemy. So again, this uncertainty of war, the interaction with the enemy, this is another continuity, I think, and another lesson you could say that cuts across all three of the wars. And in Vietnam, for example, as Mark Moyar observed in a book called Triumph Forsaken, the North Vietnamese did not impose limits on themselves when the enemy limited ourselves, but instead became more aggressive to exploit the enemy's self-imposed restrictions. So in Afghanistan and Iraq, if you think about really how the enemy has responded to us and our actions in recent years, I think you can draw conclusions that are analogous to our experience in Vietnam. And then finally, the fourth continuity, that war is fundamentally a contest of wills. In Iraq and Afghanistan, I think that we have seen that from the very beginning of the war in Afghanistan, for example. Why did the Taliban regime collapse so quickly at the end of 2001? I think it was fundamentally because every Afghan was convinced of the inevitability of the Taliban's defeat. And what we have done since then may have sent mixed signals to the enemy in terms of our resolve to see the enterprise through, consolidate those gains, and get to a sustainable outcome there, consistent with our vital interests and why we went to war to begin with, which we ought to remember, was the mass murder of over 3,000 Americans on September 11, 2001. So in Vietnam, in terms of war as a contest of wills, Lyndon Johnson's advisors went to extraordinary lengths to rationalize what they knew by that time were flawed approaches to the problem of Vietnam. In a 1964 planning memo, John McNaughton, who had been a Harvard Law School professor, and I'm not bagging on lawyers at all, I'm just saying that perspectives from other professions sometimes reach their limit when they confront war and warfare, mainly because of these continuities. And so, as Sir Michael Howard has said, wars still resemble each other more than they resemble any other activity. So when we take the latest insights from business management theory or from law or from science or technology and say, well, war is going to change fundamentally because of this advancement in this other field, that's typically when we get on dangerous ground. But in this planning memo, John McNaughton defined the primary objective in Vietnam as the preservation of American credibility. And he concluded that it was unnecessary to win the war to achieve that objective. America simply had to get bloodied and appear as a good doctor who did all he could for a terminally ill patient. McNaughton, of course, failed to consider that war, involving as it does, and who the men who are going to follow me on this panel know better than anybody, that war involves great sacrifice, killing, and the prospect of death. And because of that, it unleashes a psychological dynamic that precludes the easy acceptance of defeat. And it also precludes really trying to understand war through the use of operations research methods or business analogies and so forth. So McNaughton, McNamara, and others, they labored under the illusion that war could be controlled with a great deal of precision from Washington. They thought the graduated pressure would permit America to simply stop the application of force if the limited bombing and covert activities failed to achieve positive results. This led to a strange situation in which we equated activity with progress in Vietnam. And there are a couple stories I could tell. Maybe if you've got a few questions, I want to leave time for a couple of questions about that if you'd like. In Iraq and Afghanistan, I think there have been some signs that we also are taking this linear approach and that we're discounting at times that war is a contest of wills. And I think it's important for us to learn from these four continuities and apply that to national defense in the future, and our understanding of how to win the fight in Afghanistan. I wouldn't hesitate to use the word win. I mean, I think that you can define an outcome that equates to winning, which involves really defeating the enemy. These are the Taliban and transnational terrorist organizations that are in that part of the world. Defeat means they can no longer effectively pursue their strategy, which of course entails in part, killing our children. So I think the stakes are high, and I think we have to explain those stakes, and then we have to have that determination to see it through. But I think that there are obviously always problems, always obstacles to learning lessons from previous wars. And I think that we see some of those obstacles emerging today, for example, in what is becoming conventional wisdom about future war. And I would say that going along with these four continuities in war, political, human, uncertainty, and contest of wills, are four fallacies about future war that are really exercises in self-delusion that are giving us easy solutions to some of the problems we're facing, budget problems and so forth, today in our nation. And these four fallacies, I would say the first of these is a return of sort of the thinking behind graduated pressure that made a comeback in the 1990s under the revolution in military affairs and rapid decisive operations and all sorts of other hubristic terms that said war was going to be fast, cheap, and efficient, and that we could win wars mainly through the application of firepower onto land from the maritime and aerospace domains. And so today you see this manifest itself in some defense thinking that says, that we can do that again in the future. Some of the versions of air-sea battle, which I'm all for, and everybody should be all for, to gain access, evidence some of this kind of thinking. So I would call that fallacy the vampire fallacy, because it keeps coming back. You can't kill it, you know. And it's tied all the way back to strategic bombing theory in the 1920s in terms of its intellectual roots. The second fallacy, I think, associated with that's muddling and our thinking and preventing us from learning lessons from Vietnam and from Afghanistan, Iraq, for that matter, is what I would call the rating sort of fallacy, or maybe the zero dark 30 fallacy. You know, that we essentially just need a global SWAT team that can, you know, conduct raids against nodes and enemy networks, and that's all we need for national defense. Now, both of these are immensely important capabilities, right? Our surveillance capabilities, our precision strike capabilities. Who doesn't want that? It's tremendous what our Air Force and Naval forces and our Army forces can deliver in that connection. Who doesn't want the awesome Special Operations Forces capabilities we have? I mean, it is the most professional, capable, I think you could make the argument, aspect of our force. But these capabilities, they get confused with strategies. They get confused with answers to the problem of national security, again, largely because we neglect the four continuities in war and warfare. The third of these analogies, and most in this crowd might understand this from their young days, I would call it the mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom fallacy. And this is like, we as the United States will be like Marlin Perkins, and we won't get involved in messy ground wars or down there with the wildebeests and lions. We'll get Jim, you know, remember his society, we'll get Jim, other armies to do that for us. And again, this alludes to another important capability, which is our advisory capability and operating with indigenous forces. But of course, because of the continuities in war, political interests might not be the same. For example, you can't solve the problem of future war by getting other people to do your fighting for you. And the fourth fallacy, I think, is simply an opt-out fallacy. You know, what you'll hear is, we're just not going to do that anymore. But of course, as, not to quote a communist, but as Trotsky said at the end of the Bolshevik Revolution, you know, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And so it's important for us not to adopt this narcissistic approach to find the problems of future national security as we would like them to be, but to acknowledge the four continuities in war and warfare. And that, I think, will open the door for us to connect the lessons of Vietnam to the lessons of Afghanistan to the lessons of Iraq. Thank you very much.